Hello, welcome to the LPL Brief. I know that some of you were asking about the LPL immersion. I don't really like it in general because I don't feel like I can talk as in-depth about certain topics as I want to if I'm just briefly going through each of the teams. And I think it's more valuable to do like the LPL Brief format that I was doing, where I did a reflection on a specific team or something that was really short a day after the game. So I'm going to try to keep these more regular, and this means kind of more stuff, and you can pick what you want to hear about, and there's something that's a little bit more rewarding. I'm also going to include, when I go over my topic, just like some brief reflections on the games that were played. So nothing really huge. This is just some place to put my thoughts in general and my immediate reactions rather. So the first topic I want to discuss is the impact and the idea of the Chinese teams at Intel Extreme Masters. And this is a little bit late, but I think that now that there have been a couple of weeks, we can kind of see whether or not there was actually an effect of QG and Royal going to this tournament and losing on the rest of the LPL and the league, and if there was any strategic change or anything like this. So, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the main criticism that was levied against QG and Royal Never Give Up, which is that broadly, Chinese teams don't know how to lane swap. And going into this, I didn't really think that Chinese teams would pick up lane swapping, and to an extent they really didn't overall. This wasn't one of their major takeaways. They kind of tried to adopt the Western lane swap in some of their games. You saw with that really weird QG Fnatic series where they sort of did it well the first game, and then there was like this counter swap that was completely botched by both sides in the second game. Things like this that were very strange. So first of all, some people may not really understand why teams do the Western style lane swap or the Korean style lane swap or this sort of predominant style of lane swap where teams are 3v0 pushing. The jungle is usually farming a camper or something, or if a team is behind, then the jungle will join the team and try to push the tower faster. Usually, ideally, you want to put some creeps or some extra experience or lone turret experience on the top laner and then bounce the wave so that everything works properly. And this is like the ideal lane swap execution, because then you're going to swap the lane, right? Because you bounce the wave, because when you swap back, you have to push again to get to the other turret. It's all very exciting, but one of the reasons you do this is it's very difficult to kind of predict consistently this I'm going to get the dual lane kind of idea, right? It's really, really difficult to scout in this game. So if you end up in a lane swap scenario, you kind of have to think, okay, if I want a lane swap, which lanes are ideal for me? Or teams often are almost always at a disadvantage in some kind of matchup. It's very rare that across the board every lane gets an ideal matchup, right? It's like 50-50 top, 50-50 mid, 50-50 bot. That doesn't really happen. So there's an incentive to swap in almost every game. And predicting where that swap is going to end up or trying to counter that swap is nearly impossible with the scouting techniques and the limited word availability. So that's one of the big reasons why these lane swaps are happening. And then once you're in the lane, you have to think to yourself, okay, there's not really a lot of objectives to fight for. There's not really an incentive to freeze. You're going to get more reward for getting the turret and accelerating the pace of the game, getting my items, even if it means trading the turret on the other side as well. That the LPL teams were doing it was sort of strange, right? A lot of times, I think the concept behind it, from watching a lot of the games and sort of studying how they were doing the early game, wasn't just random poor execution of this ideal lane swap. It was an idea of, this is stupid, why would we give up our turrets? Why wouldn't we just take this opportunity to farm if we get lane swapped on? So what happened in a lot of these scenarios is that they would push the first turret, right? They would do this is fine. And then they would go and they would try to predict like the counter swap, and they would try to meet the 2v2. If this didn't work, which most of the time it didn't against teams like Snake, they would just lose turrets on both sides of the map, and then they would freeze. So after this, I think QG actually produced this very interesting strategy. And I thought that this strategy wasn't ideal and could be easily countered by better lane swapping teams or more aggressive teams, but I thought that it would do slightly better, and I think Fnatic overperformed to an extent, so I thought the QG would at least get out of groups, but I wouldn't be too surprised if they had lost in semis or something like this. So they kind of did this triple freeze technique in the side waves, where they could actually control the flow of the wave, and then one side would move up and push up the wave and try to bait the top laner, while the other one was like slow pushing. So they almost always got this advantage on their top laner, and then sometimes they're really, really poor at executing this advantage because I think V is improperly integrated into their team. But this was the mindset. This was the idea. It's like we're countering the swap to an extent. It wasn't super polished by most of the teams in the LPL. I think it was only QG who could really do it. So that's why I rated QG somewhat highly at that time. I think that going into the LPL, they did really, really poor into IEM, because we hear that they didn't do well in scrims. They did really, really poorly in scrims, so they tried to redo a lot of their approach in a very short, limited period of time. They added UZI to the bot lane. They tried to execute this more aggressive style, and people will say, well, they did even worse than scrims with Pekko, but a lot of times scrims end super early, right? So you don't see the fruition of some of QG's style and the way they used to play with Pekko. So I think that this might have been what happened. Again, I have no idea at all, but this is kind of my thought process watching them, because they didn't try to do like the triple freeze very much at IEM at all, and they haven't really tried to do it since either. They've done mostly a gank bot lane approach now. Do I think that the lane swaps are the reason why the Chinese teams did so poorly at Intel Extreme Masters? No, I think that if you do kind of mis-execute your lane swap in the beginning, it doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the game if your team is more cohesive, is better in general. Chinese teams made all sorts of mistakes. They made a ridiculous amount of mistakes, and then people were hammering and over again, SKT don't even lane swap in this way that we just discussed. Like, they were constantly behind Fnatic in the swap, right? But then they always came back. So I think this is very key to think about, is that Chinese teams have a lot more mistakes than just lane swaps. They were panicking, trying to get fights without vision coverage. They were maybe not aggressing. I really, really disagree with Xiao Xiao's comment that he made about how Chinese teams aren't playing Chinese, because if you watch QG games in LPL, they don't really try to fight a whole lot. Like, some of the games, I think they just kind of go for it, but most of their games, they wait 20 minutes with this double free strategy and all this thing, so I don't think QG played that dissimilar to the way they naturally want to play, but they played it dissimilar in the opposite direction of the way Xiao Xiao was saying they did. If this are okay at playing from behind, they'll get a fight, but a lot of times I think they're taking advantages of mistakes. I always fixate on Baron. Royal aren't a super strategic team. They haven't been a super strategic team. I thought they'd lose the first game to Origin. If they can get an immediate lead, I think Royal plays significantly better strategically, but we're not going to talk about this in depth. Then, have LPL teams change the way they lane swap? Yes and no. Yes, in that we see a lot more 2v2s top, okay? We see a lot more 2v2 top, so teams are sending their duo lanes top. I think this is in both to counter the lane swap, because they know teams like Snake will almost always lane swap, so they will send their 2v2 top just automatically to counter Snake. And so Snake's lane swap rate has gone down from like 80% to 65% because teams just counter swap on them. They still send their duo lane top the most of any team in the LPL, but teams are counter swapping them, so their overall lane swap rate is going down. The other aspect, and this I think is actually really related to the double duo top, is increased Rift Herald priority. So Rift Herald was sort of ignored in the LPL in the first 5 weeks, but coming back, the first 5-6 weeks, but coming back to the LPL, since Intel Extreme Masters, the rate for some of the teams that are winning more games, like QG, like Royal Never Give Up, have increased by almost 10%. The average time at which the first Rift Herald is taken for any team across the board, so if you take the Rift Herald a bit later, you're then the first Rift Herald that's taken, your Rift Herald is still counted because it's your first Rift Herald of the game, on average has decreased by 1 minute. So everything together across all 8 weeks, the change in the Rift Heralds has been so significant in the past 2 weeks that it's gone down by a complete minute. You see games where there are as many as 3 Rift Heralds taken. Okay, it's actually pretty ridiculous. And after the Rift Herald is taken, sometimes LPL teams will then initiate a delayed swap. So you've got them fighting, the jungle comes top, right? Okay, and then the 2v2 kills the other 2v2 with the help of the jungler. They go get the Rift Herald, they take the Rift Herald, and then they start pushing towers. And then the other team sends their dual lane bot to try to push the other tower, and then you have pretty much a lane swap scenario, but 5 or 10 minutes delayed from when most people do it. So it's really weird because it's like we have to compensate for the fact that they have Rift Herald by trying to take this turret in response. It's the best trade we can get. But this is kind of one thing that's happening. This isn't happening to every team. I actually see Edward Gaming doing more lane swaps. Edward Gaming have actually been ahead in the lane swap scenarios of the last 3 series they've had. Caveat, their series have been against HYG, M3, and EPA. But they have... M3 is actually not a terrible lane swapping team. It's like one of the few things they do well. But they've been ahead in the lane swap in all of these series when they've done a lane swap. QG and EDG had a game where they pushed to second tier turret and did complete trades with this, and it was all very smooth. I think EDG are taking the turrets and initiating the lane swap so they can transition to Rift Herald earlier. Right? And then they try to take another turret off that. So it's almost like they're using the lane swap to get the Rift Heralds to push more turrets. But they aren't just using it to push turrets, right? Because when I watch them do it, a lot of times they give it to Clearlove, and EDG's strategy, since they lost to QG, has actually been very, very jungle-centric. They invade a lot, they secure both of the scuttle crabs in the game so that they can invade easily, and then they use the higher mobility from the Rift Herald to clear super fast, things like this. So I think that it's almost like they're learning the lane swap and they're initiating these lane swap techniques so that they can execute their jungle centric strategy, which is smart but kind of backwards from the way we'd normally think about it. So I think it's really interesting to look at, and I'm really curious to see if Edward Gaming can do this against some of the stronger teams in their group, like Royal Never Give Up. Pretty much just Royal Never Give Up. Yeah. I asked Xiang from Oh My God directly about lane swaps and Intel Extreme Masters, and I asked him about Intel Extreme Masters, right? And directly about the lane swap criticism, and he didn't talk about the lane swaps in his answer, and I heard the Mandarin Chinese, so it wasn't a mistranslation of my question necessarily, and he just talked about Rift Herald and how watching Intel Extreme Masters made Chinese teams realize the importance of Rift Herald. So this is actually a direct result of IEM, according to Xiang. So I thought that was interesting. That interview will be coming out pretty soon, I think, so wait for that if you're curious. A reflection on some of the games today. So we had 2 series, Edward Gaming versus Hyper Youth Gaming, and I kind of already talked about some of the stuff we're seeing in EDG games. And then we had Vici Gaming versus Invictus Gaming. So I talked very, very briefly about what Edward Gaming do, which is they've been lane swapping more to get Rift Herald early, to invade, and to clear camps super fast. They've been able to use team coordination with these invades with both Athena and Palm, which is something I think that they lacked last year with Bamey. Like, they may introduce Scout into the rotation since Scout joined the team, so that could be a deal breaker kind of, but they've been able to follow up his invades. He's been playing super aggressive champions, like all full AP Evelyn, okay? He's been really enjoying this Runic Echoes thing, and Kindred, and just kind of destroying the... Even with Gragas, he was able to kind of beat up on EPA's Crisis. This is Nidalee with Gragas because of the way the team coordination works, because of the way Edward Gaming's vision has been very well done lately in getting these early leads and ending games with this strategy in under 25 minutes. Again, their opponents have been Masters 3, Energy Pacemaker All, and Hyper Youth Gaming, arguably the 3 worst teams in the league. So when they play against Invictus Gaming this weekend is a slightly better team. They looked somewhat shaky against Masters 3. I will give them that. First game, I think they had a little throw that they didn't need to have. So these are the question marks that I have about, okay, are Edward Gaming are picking more to suit their style and their strengths. They're playing more to suit their styles and their strengths. They're playing a lane swap more tightly than they did before. They are coming up with some of these new ideas with taking blue buff first only or A buff first only and then immediately transitioning to these Rift Heralds and securing them to get complete control of the pathways, or not complete control, but very good control of the pathways between jungles. These are all great ideas that are coming from them, so if they can kind of do this against other teams, Edward Gaming might win the LPL again. And now, of course, that I've said this, they won't. But it's something to keep an eye out for. LPL Gaming versus Invictus Gaming. This series was really weird. It was really weird because there were some good parts to it and some bad parts to it. Invictus Gaming showed that they had learned some ideas from the fact that their bottom lane was getting repeatedly targeted in the series that they lost, right? Their bottom lane is free food. They showed that their jungler is willing to come and counter gank bot when this happens because it's a very obvious thing that's going to happen. So that was a good start, but their bottom lane still got dove and destroyed because Rain and Kitties are probably the worst bottom lane in the LPL. The other thing that they showed was they're playing more of these hyper-scaling, protect the AD Kog'Maw comps. I think Rain is kind of a Kog'Maw main-ish, maybe? I don't know for sure, I'm making this up. But I also know that Chris, one of their coaches, really likes protects the AD carry comps, and this is his solution to everything. So even though their AD carry is not very good, and you're putting all of your eggs into his basket, it's kind of working because it prevents him from his positioning. It's like kind of how Snake played in spring of last year, where they just put a bunch of peel on Crystal, and even though Crystal positioned weird, he would get in the front line and he would do a lot of damage. So it's the same kind of strategy. It's easily counterable, just like most of IG's stuff. What they were doing to have success before is that both Rookie and Zatai would get really good leads, and they would freeze the wave in the middle of the lane. They're good at this, and then they would communicate to Kid to come gank. So Kid could get free ganks pretty much wherever on the solo lanes. Both solo laners are at the top in terms of gold lead, CS leads at 10 minutes, so they're really, really good at controlling these lanes. It's not just Rookie, it's actually also Zatai. So then you have the gaping wound in the bottom lane that's just saying, please, come stab me, please. And that's where it all falls apart. But we always knew IG always has another shoe. Let's see what they do or how they develop from here, but they're at least showing some thoughts. Vici Gaming, I think, are really dependent on EasyHoon as a roamer. So Teleport Victor was something they wanted to choose. He's having his Rise band against him, he's having his Lissandra band against him, both things that he was very effective against. He didn't pull out the Twisted Fate, which I was a bit surprised about. I'd have to look at the picks again to see if there was something that counters it. I think Rookie sort of threatened, hovered the Yasuo. He probably would have played it, to be honest. Because I think Long is strong, I think Dandy is strong, and I think EasyHoon needs a champion that has global pressure. And their bottom lane is pretty bad, but still not as bad as Rain and Kitties. Those are kind of how I saw that series going, because they were able to pressure the Victor well, and then they, even though Rain got dove a lot, he's playing Kog'Maw, so it was late game focus, and when he was with his team, they made it really hard for him to die with things like Lulu and Orianna and Braum and big tanks. Tomorrow's matches are watch LGD and QG, because I think that LGD were showing some signs of improvement. I just still don't think they'll win, even though they have improved. But this match could really, really tell us if they actually did improve or not, or if they're still a mess or something that was really short. a day after the game, so I'm going to try to keep these more regular, and this means kind of more stuff, and you can pick what you want to hear about, and there's something that's a little bit more rewarding. I'm also going to include, when I go over my topic, just like some brief reflections on the games that were played. So nothing really huge. This is just going to this tournament and losing on the rest of the LPL and the league, and if there was any strategic change or anything like this. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the main criticism that was levied against QG and Royal Never Give Up, which is that broadly, Chinese teams don't know how to lane swap. And going into this, I didn't really think someplace to put my thoughts in general and my immediate reactions rather. So the first topic I want to discuss is the impact and the idea of the Chinese teams at Intel Extreme Masters. And this is a little bit late, but I think that now that there have been a couple of weeks, we can kind of see whether or not there was actually an effect of QG and Royal that Chinese teams would pick up lane swapping, and to an extent they really didn't overall. This wasn't one of their major takeaways. They kind of tried to adopt the Western lane swap in some of their games. You saw with that really weird QG Fnatic series where they sort of did it well the first game, and then there was like this counter swap that was completely botched by both sides in the second game. Things like Hello, and welcome to the LPL Brief. I know that some of you were asking about the LPL immersion. I don't really like it in general because I don't feel like I can talk as in-depth about certain topics as I want to if I'm just briefly going through each of the teams. And I think it's more valuable to do like the LPL Brief format that I was doing, where I did a reflection on a specific team